I'll call this meeting of the Bellevue City Council to order. This is the City Council's extended study session for October 14th, 2019. I would like to add a quick item, which is the excusal of Councilmember Robertson to the head of the agenda. So with that caveat, I would entertain a motion on the agenda.
I move that we approve the amended agenda.
Second.
All those in favor of the amended agenda say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The amended agenda is adopted. Councilmember Robertson had a death in the family. She was attending a funeral today. Obviously, she is not going to attend the meeting tonight. Our condolences, and I know all of those go out to her. She lost her sister. And our condolences and our prayers go to her and to her family. So with that, I would entertain a motion to excuse Councilmember Robertson for tonight.
I move that we excuse Councilmember Robertson tonight.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. The motion passes. We're now at communication, written and oral. How many individuals do we have to sign up tonight? 5 individuals? Okay. Who is up first?
Saki.
I'm sorry?
Saki.
Okay. So I'm going to ask actually both. You have 3 minutes to speak to the City Council on any topic tonight. With 5 people, we will be able to make that work. We'll make it within our half hour. Looking in the audience, I think almost all of you know the drill. Mr. and Mrs. Leetoff, if you would come forward, and I will just explain what we're going to do. They're both requesting their 3 minutes. They're going to speak together. They have a video that they would like to show, and they're also going to talk about a very important topic that we're dealing with throughout the world today. So with that, and what we're going to do is just let both of them go until they're going to share their 6 minutes together. Okay? So please go ahead.
Council, my name is Saki Litov, and I'm a resident of Eastgate. I'm here this evening to ask your support by standing with your local Jewish community. The Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle recently released its community statement on anti-Semitism and is asking for the support of our elected officials by signing on to the statement and making a commitment to unite with other elected and civic leaders to combat the rise of anti-Semitism and other manifestations. Why, you may ask, is it important to single out anti-Semitism as a cause to defend when there are so many worthy causes worthy of your attention? My answer begins with additional questions. Why is it that Jews, although a tiny percentage of the population of the U.S., are the victims of over half the reported hate crimes? And why has anti-Jewish rhetoric, once confined to right-wing extremists, now infesting the American left as well? In a way, Jews can be considered the proverbial canary in the coal mine. In the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, anti-Semitism is the world's most reliable early warning sign of a major threat to freedom, humanity, and the dignity of difference. It matters to all of us, which is why we must fight together. Anti-Semitism at its base is about the denial of the Jewish people's right to exist collectively as a people with the same rights as everyone else. The issue is complicated by the fact that Jews, as a group of people who are indigenous to the ancient land of Israel and who were ethnically cleansed and expelled from their homeland on numerous occasions, can be considered a race or an ethnicity as well as a religion. And Jews, as you'll note from the brochure we handed out, come in every color imaginable and are from many places around the world. In fact, as a direct result of these historic expulsions, the Jews in Israel, as a majority, are people of color from throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. The UN recently released an unprecedented report called Combating Anti-Semitism to Eliminate Discrimination and Intolerance Based on Religion or Belief. The report identifies violence, discrimination, and expressions of hostility motivated by Jew hatred as a serious obstacle to the enjoyment of the right to freedom of religion and belief. It expresses a serious concern that the frequency of anti-Semitic incidents appears to be increasing magnitude, and that the prevalence of anti-Semitic attitudes and the risk of violence against Jewish individuals and sites appears to be significant, including in countries with little or no Jewish population. I'm here this evening to ask your support by joining the over 90 elected officials who've already signed on, including, I'm proud to say, our own council members, Jennifer Robertson and Jared Neuenhaus. Thank you both. A link to the place to sign on is included in my notes from the evening, as well as links to informational sources I've mentioned and informative videos. The City of Bellevue's vision statement released in 2014 states that Bellevue welcomes the world. Our diversity is our strength. Please join us in ensuring the statement truly applies to all.
And I'm going to just jump in. And good evening. Thank you for letting us speak. I really appreciate that. My name is Laura Litov. I live with him in Eastgate. And I'm here to speak about anti-Semitism as well, but from a more personal viewpoint. My kids have grown up in King County knowing their lives are at risk. Not because we tell them, but because we have regular reminders. Every Jewish preschool, elementary school, evening program, summer camp, swim club, and of course synagogue or college Jewish community center that we attend is guarded by armed police security, that is including in Bellevue. Our kids remember the Jewish Federation shooting murder in Seattle. We had friends there. That leaves a personal imprint about innocent people. Oh, all of a sudden, do you want to read it?
Where are you?
Here. I'm good now, sorry. Jewish events have police presence. A local celebration for Israel a couple of years ago, we counted over 50 police officers for a couple of hundred people. Ask our local law enforcement how many police they had at a recent memorial service in Bellevue for the murder at a synagogue in California. The events that come up in the news all the time. The murders, I'm sorry.
I'm just going to start here.
Okay.
Anti-Semitic vandalism in language is growing and becoming normalized, which creates fertile ground for more hate and violence. Spewing anti-Semitic rhetoric is becoming so commonplace. A high school student at Parkland had his Harvard admission rescinded because he was on social media stating things like, "kill all the Jews." Think about how far we are down the road of normalizing anti-Semitism when a Harvard-bound child feels like it's mainstream and acceptable to spew things like that publicly on social media and are surprised when there's a consequence. The stories local high school and college students can tell you include being denied service in restaurants for being Jewish, having money thrown at them, been told to go to the gas chambers, swastikas and hate rhetoric written on their desks and doors, or spray painted on the outside of their homes, and more.
And I'm going to just say that for local law enforcement, because I want to make it here too. The FBI arrested and convicted in June a Snohomish County white nationalist for terrorizing and threatening to massacre Jews. He had an arsenal and timeline. Western Washington University has had to create a task force concerning hate crimes against Jews because it is such a problem. A Somali immigrant from West Seattle is in jail awaiting trial for attempting to kill Jews. Last year, a college student was stabbed to death by a previous classmate. The neo-Nazi organization that the perpetrator is involved in has a growing cell in Skagit County. So thank you to council members who've already signed for this pledge. We gave you some information, and I look forward to seeing everybody else's name on that pledge too. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much for your testimony. Thank you for making us aware of that and with the link. I see that Mr. and Mrs. Morris wish to testify. I'm going to move. I don't know where you are on the side. Or did you want to testify? Did you sign up? I'm going to move you up to this time. I don't know if you're ahead or behind, but I'd prefer to do it that way. So, Mrs. Morris, if you'd like to go, and then Mr. Morris, you could be next. Thank you.
First, I want to check that the mic is working, because apparently there was an issue when I was testifying last time. So can everybody hear me? Okay. Karen Morris, my address is on file. Comment on things said at the last meeting on the tent encampment ordinance. City staff told you they see their role not so much as regulators, but rather facilitators. It was said that a neighborhood fracture had occurred between the last stays at TBT, and the city staff recommended mediation, implying mediation was an effective way of resolving such issues. There was no fracture between neighbors, just years-long issues getting host and operator to address with action unresolved problems the encampment had created and had not been willing to address with anything but rhetoric. Neighbors documented these problems and wanted something substantive done. As we had for years already, we followed staff's suggestion and entered mediation willing to try. It accomplished nothing on substantive problems we presented to be addressed. More importantly, it was not the promised safe space to discuss issues. Host participants were unwilling to compromise on these issues and seemed to have another agenda. More on that later. They pulled out of mediation without addressing our major concerns, and in the silent presence of the city mediator, one engaged in angry, inappropriate labeling and name-calling before leaving. His issue? Resentment of gathering and bringing documentation to meetings to prove problems existed had been brought up before and still had not been solved. So we don't accept the role of staff as facilitation that goes nowhere with those not willing to compromise. We ask staff and council to do their jobs as regulators and enforcers to maintain the public health and safety. It may be very difficult, but it is demonstratively the only way that it might work. Now the mayor's comments. He recognized issues in our neighborhood, the only one which had recent and repeated encampments. He again made a link between doing other things on the homelessness issue and not having to have tent cities. Unfortunately, this linkage is false. Regulation allows this use only as religious expression, and the presence of other adequate or even more than adequate programs will not change that. If an operator like Share convinces a religious organization to host them, it will still happen. The only thing the city can do and has a responsibility to its citizens to do is to regulate operations to protect the public health and safety. This includes actual enforcement. I and my neighbors speak here as the canary in a coal mine speaks. We are not outliers who can be safely ignored, but harbingers of what can and has gone wrong. Proposed changes weaken needed protections and ignore valid pleas for increased accountability and responsibility. They also ignore recalcitrance and lack of cooperation. I will be waving my feathers when statements are made that are untrue or misleading, and as usual, it will be something I can back up, not just belief or opinion.
Thank you. Mr. Morris?
Good evening, I'm John Morris, and my address is on file. Happens to be the same as the person who just left here. I want to talk tonight about the temporary encampment at Luca, and particularly the agenda memo that came out. The Bellevue staff has recommended 4 topic areas in the agenda menu concerning the temporary encampment based on questions directed to them by the City Council. The topic areas are very valid ones, and if addressed with actual input from all stakeholders, would reflect the real situation within affected areas and give you, the City Council, good information to make informed decisions on this topic. The agenda menu uses the term stakeholders very liberally. Stakeholders are Share, the hosts, the Church Council of Greater Seattle, and the neighborhoods. Whether you agree or not, the reality is that the host and the CCGS have proved that they will always align and vote with Share. Therefore, there are really only 2 entities as stakeholders with views. Of the 4 topic areas, I'm concerned with really only number 2, number 3, and number 4, if you look at the agenda menu. The neighborhood engagement. Well, there has been no engagement beyond a single introductory meeting in January of this year. Number 3, consistent and predictable durations of encampment. Despite Bellevue having this, staff has determined that the stakeholders all agree that a duration of 120 days was more consistent with regional standards and is so proposing that. There was no agreement with the neighbors group, who comprised 25% of the stakeholders, or really only 50%, nor even a discussion of that. It just never happened. Streamlined permit process for encampments is number 4. The dissent decree signatories sought a streamlining of the permitting process. Well, I'll bet they did. So what did the staff do? They made up a story that the focus group in that momentous single January meeting expressed support for increased permitting flexibility. Instead of requiring a permit every time, the staff deduced that a 5-year permit was a great idea, and each new stay within that 5 years would only require the following of the host: a courtesy letter that they'd be there. That's great. description of the proposal, arrival, departure dates, and identification of any modifications they wanted to make. This is a joke and an insult to the neighbors who have dealt with the situation in good faith for close to 15 years. The staff just caved in to what Cher has wanted. They subjugated themselves not to the citizens of Bellevue, but to the leaders of groups whose members largely are not even Bellevue residents. Thank you.
Mr. Zimmerman?
Yeah, and there was one additional sign up just
Oh,
now.
okay. So, Mr. Zimmerman?
Oh, I can?
Yes, thank you.
Each time that they give me permission for speaking, it makes me happy, a little bit surprised. Thank you very much. Sorry for my small circus. Yeah. Well, okay, how we can pull this? Oh. Okay. No. Oh. Okay. Sie Heil, my dirty Führer. A coming Nazi Gestapo, a coming Nazi demo pig from Animal Farm. A fascist, Gestapo, anti-Semite, and killer. I want to speak about Seattle fascism, because Seattle fascism go bigger and bigger every day. And I have a little bit to you, because you probably don't understand what's going on. Yeah, like these two Jews, you know, this means they don't understand what is going on. So a few months ago in May, right, Seattle Council, 5, Brown Council, Latina, who represent only 7%, so by definition is not by U.S. Constitution, a law too. Make a new city council code, so right now everybody who have different opinion can be trespassed for 1 year. It's no analogy in American history. It's a pure fascism, yeah. It's because Alex Zimmerman, yeah, everybody knows this. So a couple weeks ago, they make another correction. Right now, they correct a hate speech. So they allow criminal, so hate speech before is very complicated, you know what it means? So right now they make us a misdemeanor, so everybody right now can go in jail. So this looked to me absolutely identical what is Nazi with Gestapo did, the Soviet Communists did with KGB. It is exactly what is Seattle talking. And these two Jews who here, I'm a little bit sick from them, you know what it means? Because Jewish organization and Anti-Defamation League support one-party system. Seattle is one-party system who stand, for my understanding, almost 30 years. If they support this, it's a fascism. How Jew can support fascism? Little bit correction. So right now I speak to everybody who listen to me. Guys, go look Seattle Council Code. You will be surprised. It's go bigger and bigger and bigger. So right now this will be involved in country, state Washington. Another couple of years, we all will be one party or fascism. It's exactly what has happened. So I right now speak to everybody who listen to me. Stand up, America. I live here approximately 35 years, and I'm sick from fascism before half my life. So we need clean this dirty chamber from this council, and Mayor Durkan, who ex-U.S. prosecutor, so approve my 2 trespasses for my speech in council chamber.
Time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We need to stop on this fascism now. It will be late, like with Hitler or Stalin.
Who is that?
Michael Ramos?
Oh, okay. I didn't see him come in. Mr. Ramos.
Good evening, Michael Ramos with the Church Council of Greater Seattle. As I heard our name used, I decided we should speak for ourselves as opposed to being spoken for related to the proposed tent encampment Luca. I just want to introduce that the faith communities will be taking up seriously the legislation. I know you've been working on that. We'll have some recommendations as we gather to be able to meet in the coming weeks. We had not planned that this would be taken up this year. I think it had been said at a previous meeting that the faith community asked for such a change, and we did not. At least the Church Council of Greater Seattle did not. We are a signer on the consent decree, as you know, and follow closely the good work that's being done on homelessness within this city. However, since it is on the table, we will be entered into the conversation, and we'll try to find a way to participate as we have throughout the different processes related to homelessness and affordable housing from a strategic vantage point and also a principled vantage point. And so I just want to mention a few things for consideration, and then we will have further conversation in the coming weeks and with the public hearing coming up in early November, as I understand it. First, that there are laws protecting religious institutions and their exercising of ministry and hosting the homeless. Since the consent decree, there has been relevant state law that has passed, and also other ordinances in other cities that may be relevant and helpful for your consideration, that it should at least be examined. As you are aware, faith communities operate from a principled basis that treatment of homeless people as human beings is fundamental, who have a basic dignity and rights and should be respected within the faith communities where they're hosted. And there's a balancing with concerns that may exist within the community, but I would submit that people who are experiencing homelessness are part of the community as well. Finally, I would just say that we had discussed previously different ordinances on the east side that might cover the different cities on the east side. We submitted a list of principles to the various cities several years ago with the participation of your police department and others. Unfortunately, those principles and values were not taken up in discussion here, and they worse, they were bypassed by other cities who passed ordinances without taking into account what we had submitted. So I would like to be able to submit those principles for your consideration in the discussion and to have further conversation with you at the appropriate time. Again, thank you for entertaining talking with the faith communities directly and how we can continue to serve and honor people who are experiencing homelessness in your city and throughout the east side.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wishes to address the council tonight who did not sign up? Seeing none, that I will close the comment for tonight. Let's see. There's no council business or new initiatives. Yes, Council Member Zahn.
Can I make a comment about the two speakers that spoke earlier about the anti-Semitism? Can we talk?
We typically try not to engage in back and forth. I think I do think it's a very important topic, but we tend not to do that. It has been sometimes good council moments, sometimes the worst council moments. So that's why we
Yeah.
why
So
we do that.
I wasn't bringing it up to engage with them. In fact, actually, they're not here. I just think that it is a very important piece for us to show unity for our community and denounce hate in our community and be united. So
I would agree, and it's the first that I had heard about this document, so we hear about lots of things, and so I think if council members so choose, they can go and lend their name to it. I think that's a good idea. So anything else? That would bring us to a discussion on the affordable housing strategy and a briefing on implementation. Mr. Miyake.
So good evening, council members. As you mentioned, we're here tonight to give the council an update on the implementation of the affordable housing strategy strategic plan. Just by way of background, this plan was actually adopted by the City Council back in June of 2017. At that time, the council asked to bring forward updates twice a year. The last update to the council was back on March 4th. And so tonight, we're bringing another update back to the council, in particular how we've been doing in terms of the generation of affordable units. This update is just information only. We're not asking for any direction from the council. With that, we have Matt Cummins, the Director of Community Development. To his left is Janet Loyne, our Senior Planner. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Matt.
Thank you, City Manager Miyake. We're happy to be back this evening giving this next update on the affordable housing plan implementation and/or unit creation. By way of introduction, the council is going to be undertaking a number of affordable housing dialogues in the coming months, and we're going to talk about that tonight because there are yet a number of strategies contained within the affordable housing strategic plan that haven't yet been fully implemented. The purpose of tonight's presentation will really be an update. And so you all may recall at the last dialogue, we've been talking about how best to update not just the council, but the community on progress. And so tonight, we're setting out an agenda that we intend to replicate at each of these update meetings to talk about some similar topical areas each night. We do this with you on twice a year, meaning unit creation, which strategies we're finding are the most effective in creating those units, where we are in implementing the overall strategic plan, and then what our next steps are. So we hope to get into a rhythm with you all for the updates being very different than the creation of new policy, where you'll have a completely separate study session to evaluate new strategies and procedures going forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ms. Lewine to walk through what's been going on for the last 6 months, and then we'll take questions at the end.
Okay. Good evening. Let's see. I think that Mac and City Manager hit these topics. Let's see. This is just for information. These are the things that we plan to cover tonight. Affordable housing achieved, the effectiveness of the programs, and the implementation of the actions in the strategy. Council adopted the affordable housing strategy in June of 2017, but the 21 actions of the strategy will be adopted over a 4-year phased work program. We've seen delivery of affordable homes increase over our historical averages, such as before we adopted the affordable housing strategy, we were achieving about 85 affordable units a year. But it will take time to implement the full suite of tools and reach our annual goal levels. This timeline of milestones since the adoption of the affordable housing strategy in June 2017, up until last month when Council provided direction to extend the multifamily tax exemption program. In 2 years, progress in several important tools, including adoption of affordable housing incentives in Eastgate and downtown, and work to improve the multifamily tax exemption program. Okay, now we got some numbers. This slide shows which adopted actions are achieving the affordable units. Oh, no, I got ahead of myself here. So the actions in the council adopted affordable housing strategy have resulted in 226 affordable homes achieved and 485 units in the pipeline through a combination of market incentives and direct subsidy. And the next table I have actually breaks down this a little better by program. So this slide shows the adopted actions are achieving the affordable units. Note that there's actually 3 columns going on there with 3 sums at the bottom row. The first sum is our 10-year yield that was estimated in the adopted affordable housing strategy of over 2,500 units. The next is the units achieved, like we said, 226, and a pipeline of 485. And then back to the top, yes?
Could you clarify what the annual goal was that we decided on in 2017?
The yield of the affordable housing strategy that was adopted was estimated at 2,500 units once fully implemented over 10 years. So that would be 250 units a year once we get this implemented. So back up to the top of this table, the market incentives, that's the C3 multifamily tax exemption and the C4, the voluntary incentives, they've resulted in 64 affordable units and a pipeline of 65 affordable units. And that pipeline represents about 6 apartment proposals, market apartment proposals in Bel-Red and downtown that are not yet permitted. Going down to A1, council support for A1 preservation of existing affordable housing is a priority strategy, has resulted in 76 affordable units. That was the preservation of Highland Village. and a pipeline of 240 affordable units. And that's a King County Housing Authority proposal that includes financing from Microsoft. Going down to E1, council approving funding or surplus city land for affordable housing has resulted in 62 affordable homes. That's the 30 Bellevue project that opened last year, and a pipeline of 80 affordable units. And that 80 is an estimate of what will yield from council's action to put the Spur property at the OMFE for affordable housing as a surplus land donation. And then finally, I guess what we're seeing here, because those are the main actions that are achieving the units up to date, and those units are being across both market incentives and direct subsidy, which also gets us a range of affordability by using a range of different programs. We are showing affordable homes that are being achieved near light rail. I think I cut off the bottom of this, and I'm not showing two projects that are close to the overlake. But with those, there's 152 affordable units that have been achieved near light rail. But more importantly, that pipeline of projects are all in downtown and Bell Red, and they will also, those 165 pipeline units, be within a half a mile of light rail transit. Okay, fewer numbers. Okay. As far as the actions that have been implemented, they're the ones that were achieving the units. We've got incentives adopted in East Lake and affordable housing incentives adopted in downtown. We've updated and extended the multifamily tax exemption program. Council supported state legislative changes to the condo statutes to increase condo development. We hope that we see more development response from that soon. And very substantially, E1 here, council increased funding for affordable housing in the last two budgets. Now, work program items that we're currently working on, or we see in the upcoming work program. And these I've included both things that CD is working on in our department and how we're working across departments to implement these strategies. We're working we're working with Sound Transit and across our city to achieve affordable units both at the OMFE site and the 130th station areas. We're looking to, working with finance and other departments to implement the sales tax option for affordable housing, HB 1406, before December. We're working to, Development Services has a number of work program items either now or upcoming. LUCA for East Main that will include affordable housing incentives. And then I think in upcoming work program, working on the zero lot line townhomes, which will help us have another kind of more affordable housing created in Bellevue, and a very targeted change on accessory dwelling units. That's going to be restricted just to releasing that restriction that you can't include affordable or ADUs in new construction. So, I think that what we're trying to message here is that there is a good, robust pipeline for new and preserved affordable units that includes incentives and direct subsidies that's working in Bellevue. The actual number of affordable homes is expected to increase as we implement all the 21 actions of the affordable housing strategy, and that the current pipeline gives us some sense that the current work program can achieve our goal of 10-year goal of 2,500 affordable units. And again, Bellevue's affordable housing program is working, and it seems to be gaining momentum. And it's important that we are implementing a variety of strategies and building partnerships in order to achieve this housing target that we've set. And that's it.
Thank you. So
Go so fast.
if you have questions or comments, we can just go around the table and try to keep it to 3 minutes. We can go around again if we need to. Do you want to start, Jared?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Great presentation. Thank you so much. So my first question is, so 250 units a year. So I'm grappling with this just because it's great. It seems like we're on track to hit our goals. But is it enough? Do we need to update that number? But I don't even know what that number looks like in terms of, are we creating enough affordable housing units out there? So what is your sense? I'm sure
Yeah.
most people would think we need to create more affordable housing, but what would that number look like? And do we need to adjust now? Or I know there's no action being taken tonight, but that's my first question for you.
Well, I'd first just make the comment that it's not a number that will meet the needs. It's a number that, when we adopted the affordable housing strategy, we went through a process of seeing what we could achieve with the tools that we were able to put on the table. We have a process in play where we're coming in every 6 months to update you. We're also looking hard at what we've achieved, and how the tools are working. There, for example, with the voluntary mandatory, we've talked with council about, we'll keep looking at that and seeing if we're meeting what we expected on those.
I might just add as an additional comment, we are, the gap, in provision of housing is getting bigger, day by day, week by week.
Yeah.
And all of our businesses are saying that the labor pipeline and the ability to attract talent is their number one concern as we move out into the focus groups for our economic development plan update. And then, of course, there's the dialogue just about affordability in general going on out in the community.
Right.
Bellevue is a very, very highly desirable place to be, and only getting more and more desirable every day. And that means there's more demand than there is supply, which leads to price increases.
Absolutely.
So, absolutely, we're keeping our eye on the ball there. But to Janet's point, when the original tag was put together, there was not a relationship between the total housing need for affordability and trying to hit that number.
Okay.
It was more about a robust discussion at the time about inclusionary housing versus incentive-based housing and how many units could be created.
Okay.
And that's how the strategy got.
Well, during our next update, it'd be great if we maybe looked at that in a little bit more closely. My other number, so based on the packet that we got, is that we had raised 2.4 million based off of the fee in lieu.
Yes.
Does that go into the general fund, or does that go? Where does that money go, and what is it used for?
It is earmarked for affordable housing in Bell Red. It's only collected in Bell Red,
Only
and it's
Bell Red,
only
okay.
used in Bell Red.
Gotcha.
So it's just like any, I think that they're also collecting Bell Red fee in lieu for parks and other things too. So those accounts have been created to be accessed as needed.
So only in Bell Red, but then is that money looked upon to acquire units, or can they be used for other ways to help facilitate more units? For example, if a developer wanted to do some kind of partnership of some sort, could it be used as that? I guess I'm saying, is this flexible, or is it can only be used in certain ways, that 2.4?
Okay, in addition to the 2.4, we also have another 2 million that we see coming in 2019,
Right,
2020.
I saw
So,
that. Yeah, that's great.
So that is a substantial amount. It is flexible. There isn't a lot of preservation in Bell Red, so we expect it to be a new construction.
New construction,
by low-income or King County Housing Authority partnerships.
Great, thank you.
Because we generally use our funding for those lower, 60% and below units.
Gotcha. And hopefully not over my 3 minutes. One last question on micro units. Do we have the availability to waive parking completely with micro units, or partially, or is it developer dependent, or what's our current status on that?
We are in discussions with Development Services now about that. And so in many of our neighborhood areas, meaning Bell Red versus downtown, there's a provision that allows the city staff to reduce parking requirements subject to a parking study, which has to do with the types of units that are being creating, the geographic location, proximity to transit, and so forth. And we routinely reduce those parking requirements. We have definitely heard from some developers that they would like to have a more robust discussion. We've had some developers that have suggested we should go to zero parking, which has never been the city's policy.
Never, okay.
Yeah, so
Okay.
we are actively looking at that, and micro units is part of the affordable housing strategy to be discussed in the future.
Gotcha, okay.
Yeah, that's something you'll be bringing up when you come to discuss that.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. And Mac,
Yep.
thanks for being here, especially after that tough loss this weekend. Saturday. Apparently that 2-point difference was because the mayor was actually in attendance in South Bend, so.
I didn't
Anyways.
think I would get out of this meeting totally unscathed.
So I have a question about Land Use Code 2320.
That is brutal. Mr. Stokes, you are next.
Now for something completely different. A couple of things. One, when you going through on page 13, at the bottom there, accessory dwelling units, and you follow, just to follow up, because you didn't read this part, we are looking at updating the accessory dwelling unit standards. Right?
Yes, we are, as part of our Great Neighborhoods program.
Yeah.
We'll have discussions with the neighborhoods.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's, bears repeating. We made it clear we're going to work in the neighborhoods on this. Anything we
Correct.
do is kind of neighborhood by neighborhood, but it is an effective, it's been proven in a lot of places to be an effective way to work with it. So,
Yeah, thank you for
okay.
clarifying that. That's
Yeah,
correct.
I think when you look at the numbers, and we're talking about 2,500 in 10 years, and we did 250. Obviously, if we do 250 this year, we're not meeting the need for the
Right.
next year and all. So I think it leads to what we've been discussing, and I'm looking forward to seeing, looking at what is the increased focus we need to take in terms of how do we, the numbers that are more realistic in terms of where we're going. Because I think in these last, it's been 2 years now, we've learned a lot in putting this in place. And so I think, I'm looking forward to looking at that and how do we increase the focus. And we've put more money in, and so I would think that would produce more units also.
Right.
Yeah. And we're looking more and more, and I know we're keeping up on the gap in the housing, which again continues to increase. And I think what's been really helpful is putting in a more recognition of workforce housing as an important issue. And that's one that, of course, Microsoft is very interested in.
That's correct.
In addition to, our range is not just at the 80% or at a certain level, but it's a full range. And we're looking at all of those. 'Cause sometimes I get those questions about, are we just doing 80%? Well, no. We're looking a lot. Yeah. So I guess what I'm looking forward to is our discussions, and really in terms of what other tools do we have to increase the numbers in building, and where does the funding come from? And I think, again, the conversation that started in the region and started in other cities around us, I think is helpful in terms of looking, based on what we're working on, what other cities have done, is getting a better handle on what it will take to meet this. Because, as you said in the presentation, there are a lot of companies that want to come here and they want to have housing for not only their workers, but for people who work in the other ancillary businesses and things. So, and the last thing is, how are we tracking, we have the King County Affordable Housing Task Force, which I served on, and which I feel very proud that we actually had a huge influence on the way that we shaped and how it's going. And I think I did think that we came out with some structural pieces that, and I haven't had a conversation with you, but I intended to, is some structural pieces in that are kind of an improvement of what we did. I mean, you always, as you look at things and work at them, get other ideas, you get that. So I'd like to take a look at those and see if there's some things that were incorporated in that we could use to strengthen what we're doing.
Very good.
And the last question is, we'll have to go into it now, but I would like to learn how are we now working with the organization that is the ongoing, what's the name of the Affordable Housing Task Force Committee?
Yeah.
Yeah, how that's working, what our role is in that.
All right.
All right, thank you.
Very good.
Thank you. It's good to see that we're making progress and that in the pipeline we're seeing the work. I wanted to understand with the ones in the pipeline and the 10-year yield, Are we expecting more of those to be within the half mile so that we do have the option of looking at parking and reducing that?
Right. Well, the ones that are doing the land use incentives in downtown in Bel Red, those 6 apartments that we're talking to the developers on, those are all within a half mile of stations. So yes, those will be close to transit.
Oh, that's great. And then I remembered you talked about the Microsoft funding.
Yes.
And part of their funding was they also had a menu of code revisions that they wanted
Right.
cities to consider. Are we actually looking at that? Is it one of and what is the timing for us looking at that and actually making any modifications?
So, yeah, the answer is yes, absolutely, and we're coordinating with Development Services. Microsoft's list of things that they wanted to know where all the cities were at, identify things, some of which Bellevue's already done.
Okay.
And so we are trying to get clarity around, because, for example, when we upzoned Bel Red and contemplated the ability to reduce parking or contemplated walk sheds to transit, some other communities on the east side had not done all that work yet. And so we want to make sure that we're sort of getting credit for the stuff we've already done and clarifying if there's anything else we need to do.
Okay, that makes sense. And then when you were talking about partners and a variety of stock, I mean, Saturday, several of us were on a panel talking about affordable housing as part of the teaming up. And I thought the most interesting part of the discussion was actually the tabletop afterwards, where the discussion was around if we were looking at ways to partner with the faith communities that might have land, what is it that they need from us, and what is it that we need from them? And I guess my question is, as we have identified some that may be interested in looking at some of their land, do they contact the city to start looking at possibilities? Because I understand that there was one that, well, actually, we had one that sold their property, so it was not eligible. Actually, there's another one that's done the same thing, and they were not able to work through being able to accept a proposal that had affordable housing. So before we have too many more of those happen, I'd like to understand how they might work with the city to even explore possibilities.
But both those examples that were raised at those tables were churches that we and CD and Development Services had worked with their clergy, and we had worked through ARCH with them as well to try to get anything that might be able to be put together between our affordable housing partners and the code changes or what we could do on those sites. There were a lot of restrictions. One of them was in a single-family zone, and the other one was a smaller parcel. And they did an RFP, and they just decided that the highest and best good they went with. And fortunately, the funds that were raised on that Grace Lutheran was turned over to affordable housing.
Okay, well, that's good. And then my last one is, I'm in agreement with the comments that were made earlier about let's look at if we can the micro-housing and the ability to have smaller units that then become a pipeline for people moving up in size of their family, as well as maybe seniors that want to stay in our community, as well as ADUs. My concern with ADUs is that right now the neighborhood planning is on hiatus, and when it restarts, it's going to be 6-7 years before we get through all the neighborhoods. So how do we start having that conversation with discrete neighborhoods that might be interested sooner?
Let me take a swing at that. This was a significant issue when we were setting up the neighborhood planning program, and there was concern about the city attempting a one-size-fits-all solution to ADUs. In other words, taking it up as a housing issue. There were some neighborhoods that seemed somewhat supportive of the concept, but wanted to work through how they would be developed, on the lots themselves. And there were some neighborhoods that were really not for the whole program. And the city committed at that time, even though it would take years to kind of work through, that we would do it through neighborhood planning. But if the council would like to revisit that, we can certainly work with you on the pros and cons.
So I'm not advocating for some citywide. What I am saying is that when we look at the first two neighborhoods, we were looking at how long it had been since they had gone through planning to determine which ones were first. And so for this particular item, we were not necessarily focused on which communities may be more interested in having this conversation around ADUs. So is there a way to look at a strategy for doing that discreetly with neighborhoods? So, thank you.
Conrad.
Thank you. A couple of questions and a couple of comments. The question is pretty brief. On page 9, you mentioned about the pipeline of 240 units has to do with Microsoft. Is that all 240 units, all with Microsoft partnership?
The King County Housing Authority has announced that they would buy a apartment building in Bellevue that has 240 units in it.
Okay, so it's based on that?
That's based on that.
One program alone? Okay. Second question is, on the next page 10, you showed affordable homes near light rail.
Yeah.
You were making some comments which I missed, but the question I have is, what are units estimated for that TOD development around light rails? Are the numbers included in the estimate?
It just wasn't very well shown on the slide. I'm sorry about that. There's 152 units, affordable units that have been achieved within that half mile of light rail, and there's 165 in the pipeline.
So that's 150 and
52, yeah.
165?
Yep.
Okay, so that's in addition to what you show on the previous chart?
No, those are included in the chart,
it's included
but that's
there?
just a subset of the
Okay,
ones that are
so it's
within
included in those.
that's a subset of the ones that are within a half mile of transit.
Okay, so it's part of, okay.
Most of them are.
Sounds good. And my comment would be, well, compliment to you guys. You know, we have accomplished 226, which is not quite 250, but, have 485 in the pipeline.
Yeah,
So
the
hopefully
pipeline
it will
is
accelerate.
encouraging.
Because this is a part of the process you mentioned. It's really a learning process, right? So I would like to see the next report that you have, or before the report, to include what we have learned.
Okay.
I think that's the basis where we can figure out what ideas on what we can do, right? Hopefully, when you have the information, you will say, hey, we can make 500 a year instead of 250 a year, right?
Okay.
We need to know those two. I think, that's the basis of the questions we ask. So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for taking and running the meeting. I needed to get back and didn't quite get everything finished for dinner, frankly. So there was, I was approached a while back by an individual who has some property in the Bellred or has some investors interested in it, and maybe this was asked, but it was about a zero parking building. Did you ask about that, council member? You did. Then I'll leave it at that. So I can always go back and review the record. Deputy Mayor.
When we set that goal in 2017, it seemed like somewhat of an audacious goal. And it's so amazing to see that we're actually going to make it, and then that I think we knew that it would never be enough, but it really doesn't look like it's going to be enough. So it would be interesting to have Councilmember Neuenhouse's question answers as to what the best practices would be for recommending how much affordable housing you should put in a city of this size and as we're growing. And I do think that we'll see, as you described last time you were here presenting, that there would be this momentum growing, and so it wouldn't be an even number each year. It would actually multiply each year. And
Yeah. It's the momentum of the adopted actions, and we're adopting more actions.
Yeah, so that's comforting. And in terms of the budget, next time you come, I really would like to talk about what the possibilities are with that, because as I understand it, we can, with our incentives, get 80% AMI, but the funding is really going to be necessary to get anything below 60.
We like to focus the funding on the 60 and below.
Right.
That's correct.
So it'd be great to look at what the options might be for that and how we can encourage opportunities to create that. So we just have so much opportunity right now with the light rail coming in and all the development going around with that. So thank you.
Okay.
Any other further discussion that we need? Thank you very much for the report. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Our next topic tonight is the temporary encampment land use code, which we heard some testimony about today. I will, and as the people are coming up, one of the things that is driving us toward this, and maybe I'll have a couple of questions about it, is that the consent decree that we have had for, I think, 13 years through federal court expires at about the end of January, roughly. So that's the reason that we are taking this up. But I will turn it over to Mr. Miyake to introduce.
Mayor, council members, great comment, Mayor, in terms of it is accurate that that particular agreement will, the consent decree will expire in January 2020. Just by way of background, at your September 9th meeting, the council initiated the code amendment process for temporary encampments. Then on September 23rd, the staff met with council beginning the conversation of 2 of the 4 recommended areas in terms of how we move forward on the land use code amendments. And tonight, the staff is going to go over the remaining 2 recommended areas with the hope of getting some direction from the council for purposes of drafting a draft land use code amendment for purposes of a public hearing to be held in November. So joining us tonight is Mike Brennan, who's the Director of the Development Services Department, Tony Pratt to his right, Land Use Planner, and Cindy Lynn, the Assistant City Attorney. Now I'll go ahead and turn over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Miyake, Mayor Chominak, Deputy Mayor Robinson, members of the council, good evening. It's good to be back, continuing the conversation on the topic of temporary encampments. This evening, we are seeking council direction on the topic areas that Mr. Miyake mentioned that we'll talk about in more detail in just a moment for inclusion in a draft land use code amendment that we would advance to a public hearing that is scheduled for November 18th. So again, we want to quickly just provide an overview of what was included in the initial draft land use code amendment that reflects the content of the consent decree and how we've been operating with temporary encampments over the last 13 or so years. There are a handful of additional refinements that we have set up here as the topics for consideration that we want to review again with you tonight, seeking council direction on if you would like to include any amendments in the draft land use code for that public hearing in November. The draft land use code initially covers essentially, as I mentioned, the issues that align with the consent decree and how we operate, which for the most part are the first topic area, the health and safety standards. The 3 remaining topic areas, looking for direction this evening on neighborhood engagement, duration and frequency of encampments in the city when permitted, and then streamlined permit process for repeat hosting of an encampment at a specific site. Again, looking for council direction on these topics this evening. Real quick overview of the schedule, just as a quick reminder, again, we are in council study session deliberation about the content of the draft. We will be holding a courtesy public hearing with the East Bellevue Community Council on the 13th of November. The public hearing here with the City Council on November 18th, and then we'll be looking for final deliberation and adoption by the council following that public hearing. The rough schedule is shown here. So I am going to turn over the clicker to Ms. Lynn from the City Attorney's Office, who will spend a few minutes again reviewing the draft land use code amendment and begin the topic area discussion.
Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and council members. I just want to reorientate you to the initial draft LUCA, which was originally provided on September 23rd, but we didn't have much time to go through what it included. This version includes a couple of minor edits. Certain provisions were erroneously stricken from the prior version, so this version is more up to date. The goal of this initial draft, LUCA, is to codify to the greatest extent we can the operations that we have been operating under for the administration of temporary encampments since 2006, when the consent decree went into effect. So in some ways, it's sort of like a baseline, Luca, for how we've been doing things for the last 13 or so years. I do recognize that the concept of a baseline is a little bit unusual in this circumstance because our adopted code was never implemented as adopted due to our legal action taking place immediately after the issuance of the first permit and the way the consent decree modified the code that was adopted. So this draft LUCA, so if you look at attachment A, for your convenience, we've provided kind of a comparison of the initial adopted code and then the provisions of the consent decree that modify the code. And this draft LUCA tries to adopt and take up all of the issues that are in that right-hand column of attachment A. So this is kind of how the LUCA would look if the council were to only adopt amendments to the land use code that reflect how we operate today. And if the council were to adopt this version of a land use code amendment, when the consent decree expires, we would be able to continue operating as we currently do, so per the status quo. And I will turn it over to Tony, who will explain kind of the topic areas 2 to 4, which are kind of the additional add-ons that we have recommended based on our research and experience.
Thank you, Cindy. So tonight I'm going to talk about the 4 topics for council consideration. At our last meeting, we introduced topics 1 and 2 for council consideration. I'm going to reintroduce those tonight and then delve into topics 3 and 4 for your review. So with our first topic, the alignment of the health and safety standards to the consent decree, it is our recommendation for council consideration that the health and safety standards be amended to reflect the operations under the consent decree, which is noted in attachment C. So the reason for this recommendation is that we've operated in this manner for over 13 years. The health and safety standards have proven to be effective because we haven't had any incidents of diseases, and it's been protective of public health. And it also aligns with the realities of how TC4 operates in regards to numbers of showers, sinks, and toilets. So that is our recommendation under health and safety. Moving to the next topic, which is neighborhood engagement, there are 2 items for council consideration here. The first is the removal of the litter requirement from the land use code. And then the second is to add an optional post-issuance meeting between the encampment host and neighborhood. So to take the first item, which is the litter requirement, the reason that we recommend removal of this requirement is that when I went out and I held public meetings, universally the neighbors would say that they were uncomfortable with the requirement, that it introduced non-residents to their neighborhood and it created loitering within the neighborhood. So that's the rationale for that request. In regards to the optional post-issuance meeting, we want to continue lines of communication between the encampment host and the neighborhood. We want to be able to establish a point of contact. We also want to be able to fix operational failures in time so that they could be corrected as neighbors identified them. And it also moves the city out of a role of regulator to one of a facilitator. And we saw this being implemented very well with the 5th hosting at Temple B'nai Torah. So moving to our next topic, which is duration and frequency. So currently, under our framework, a temporary encampment host can get a maximum of 90 days. It is our requirement that these days be increased from 90 to 120 days. Now, the rationale for that increase in days is that when we went out and we had conversation with the signatories of the consent decree, they stated that they wanted at a minimum of 120 days or even more days so that they can host temporary encampments on their property. Now, conversely, the neighborhood focus group stated that they understood that the temporary encampment landscape had changed since 2005, that it wasn't the same, and that the regional standard had moved to 120 days. So when staff also did the work that you saw in Attachment B and looked at how other legislation has been taking place within the region, it appears to us that there is a movement to 120 days regionally. Now, moving to the topic of frequency, currently our framework talks about an 18-month gap between deployments to the same site. It limits deployments to one deployment per calendar year, and then there is a minimum of a 180-day gap between deployments to the city. So it is our recommendation for council consideration this evening that we consolidate the site-specific and citywide requirements of the land use code and the consent decree to 12-month gap per calendar year. And the reason for this recommendation is the fact that we've operated in this manner for the past 13 years, and that it also will help with creating certainty with staffing resource and minimize impact to police and other resource. So moving to our final topic, which is the streamlined permitting process. So what this graphic is intended to show is the year one application requirements. So a temporary encampment host and an operator would have to supply all of the items in this column. This is how a temporary encampment application takes place today. This is how we've done it for the past 13 years. The only thing that's different now is that a temporary encampment host would gain a 5-year approval, and this would only be available for sites that are in good standing. So moving to our next graphic, which is intended to show the subsequent years. So contrary to what you saw with the first graphic, with the preponderance of information that was required for that submittal, there's only 4 items that will be required for the subsequent application years. We would like for the encampment host and operator to send a courtesy letter to neighbors, description of the proposal, arrival, departure dates, and identify any modifications that may need to take place. But there's 2 other items that I'd like to highlight under this subsequent year application. And the first is that with the year one approval, I want everybody to keep in mind that that year one application approval contains conditions of approval. Those conditions remain in full force and effect for the duration of the 5-year approval. The second is that when Temple Benai Torah submitted their first application in 2005, it somewhat became the gold standard for how subsequent applications should be submitted. So what happened is that we noticed that the subsequent hosts took what Temple Benai Torah submitted, they copied it. The only thing they changed was the religious tenets, the site plan makeup, and so they were already searching for ways to try to create a streamlined process for themselves. So that's the overview of the proposed process that we have, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mike.
So again, that was kind of a quick walk through the topic areas that we are seeking council direction this evening. Again, the council could essentially stay with the draft that's in front of the council that reflects the consent decree and the way that we've been operating. The council could also add amendments to the draft for consideration at the public hearing as we described. And again, just try to, for simplification of tracking here, relist those 4 topic areas for the council's consideration and for the mayor. So we are completing, that's a completion of our presentation. We are certainly available to answer any questions or provide additional information the council may wish.
Good. And I know we ran out of time. We were the last time that we had this. So I would like to, if council members want to spend some time on this, we definitely have the time to do it. I have some comments and concerns at some point in time in here, but I'm just looking to see it. Rather than call on someone who would like to go first, I'll call on the deputy mayor.
Thank you. So I see on the resident ID check what the recommendation is under the land use code amendment. And I'm wondering if it's consistent with what the regional homeless authority is going to be recommending so that they can track and get better data on our homeless problems. Is that, are we doing names and birth dates, or what kind of identification are we asking for?
Well, the encampment host, the designated person is required to have a resident log. And then we ask for a government ID so that we can keep up with the residents that are within the encampment. So we just do those traditional methods.
And that's name and birth date, right?
Correct.
And that provides that information. I think that's what they're recommending, so I just wanted to make sure we're consistent with that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Who else? I just want to make sure, do you want me to go? I'm not seeing a lot of hands go up, so I'm happy to jump in. So, yeah, go ahead, Councilmember Zahn.
I did have a question because, actually, maybe a couple of them. So we heard from the speaker earlier that there were a list of principles that the Church Council of Greater Seattle has that they wanted the cities to consider. I'm just trying to understand where it falls within these, because we now have 1 county and 3 cities that we're comparing ourselves against. We have an old consent decree. We have new state laws that have changed. I mean, it seems to me that if we're going to be doing this cleanup of the land use code, we would want to understand all of the pieces associated with it. And I guess I'm also wondering if having 3 cities and 1 county is a good. It doesn't seem like statistically that's a very large data sample of understanding what other cities might or counties might be doing. So can you help me with that?
So maybe, first of all, there is an attachment that does a little bit a more comprehensive look at what the cities around us, you're right, are doing, that, as you mentioned. We can certainly provide more specifics. This is a very high-level kind of overview or comparison, but if there's more specific information that you're looking for, we're more than happy to provide that, since we did research the ordinances in those in the county and the neighboring cities. With respect to the additional information on principles, certainly we are open and available to receiving any information that any stakeholders or parties would want to submit for consideration and information. So I have not seen anything submitted on that point yet, but certainly I expect it will be coming.
Seems like that would be good to understand, because especially when I look at the location frequency, just looking at the 4 samples, we've got no gap, 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months. So I'm having a hard time actually finding consistency amongst that data set. And so that's what's prompted maybe some questions in my mind about that.
Okay.
And then when I think about the neighborhood engagement, we talk about a post-issuance meeting being optional. I guess my question was, why wouldn't we make that a mandatory meeting? And then if not very many people come because they think things are going well, then people are sitting around having cookies. And I guess the last comment would be that once the encampment leaves, it seems like that would be a good point to do a post kind of discussion to see what are some lessons learned, so that we have that baked into our learning and whatnot. So just a couple of thoughts there.
Mm-hmm.
Councilmember Newhouse.
Tony, Cindy, Mike, thanks for the presentation. And thanks for really focusing on the 4 areas here. It's beneficial for us to focus in on that easily. The health and safety standards, no problem with that whatsoever. So I'm providing some comment here as well as a few questions. But that makes complete sense to me. On the neighborhood engagement piece, the litter requirement, just curious how many residents said they felt loitering. Hopefully they don't feel that way in my neighborhood, because I pick up garbage all the time, so hopefully they don't feel like I'm loitering. But to me, it's kind of a, depending upon if you heard at some point a number of residents saying that, but to me, I think if we can keep our neighborhood clean, I don't see an issue with that. So I'm curious how many people you talked to or said that. Was it statistically, I guess, relevant is my point.
I would say that it was very relevant. I feel that what I found from the 10 hostings and all of the public meetings that I went to, I always had to explain this requirement.
Okay.
The neighbors were genuinely very uncomfortable with having non-residents come in and patrol litter where they never had litter issues before. And
Okay.
is how the neighborhood perceived it.
So are you saying not only did they feel uncomfortable, but are you saying there wasn't a litter issue?
What the neighbors would say was, what was the purpose of this requirement? We haven't had litter issues previously.
Okay.
Why would we develop this issue now? And that was the response that many of the attendees of the public meeting generally said.
Okay.
And so there were oftentimes requests from neighbors to not do this requirement, so. but we
So
would
I'm
still-
wondering if we could adopt this to make it optional, if litter does become an issue in that neighborhood, that they could address that on a ad hoc basis. Make it optional if it does become, if it doesn't become an issue and there is no neighborhood or residents complaining about it, then we just leave it as is. But if it does become an issue, then perhaps they can take some action. Along with Councilmember Zahn here, I feel like we should keep that post-issuance meeting, just because I'm just a strong advocate of the neighborhood engagement piece, and even if not as many people show up, I still think there's value to that. I really do. On the duration and frequency, so I heard the argument of we're trying to more to regional standards, but for me, again, I just got to poke at this a little bit more. Is it a regional standard? Does that mean it's working? Does that mean it's better for our community? Is that better for our residents? Just because it's a regional standard, I'm not sure that's a convincing argument in and of itself. So beyond that, is there more convincing evidence that we should go to that longer duration? Like, for example, if you told me the longer duration would therefore give the temp encampments to find their next location, or, would help them, streamline their operations in some way, okay, that makes more sense to me, but just for the sake of regional, I'll adjust.
Right, I understand.
Yeah.
I understand the point. And so I guess there are a few responses. So what you said, I think, is true. One is finding sites for temporary encampments has been challenging.
Okay.
For the hosts. So a longer period would require that they have to, relocate less frequently. So clearly that's an upside benefit. Our experience with encampments, as we've kind of refined the approach, has been successful without significant concerns. Obviously, there have been challenges, and we've tried to respond to those challenges directly. I think that, but the experience has been that they're managed in a way that has not created a dramatic impact, let's say, although not without impact.
Okay.
And I think that just from again, as I mentioned, from finding a site and location just regionally, that 120 days becoming the kind of the more of the norm, I think has been kind of what we're hearing.
Okay. And then my last comment on the streamlined permit process, hey, if this can help streamline paperwork and take more work off of your shoulders, I think that's great. Become more efficient at this. But I would like to put some teeth in it in terms of if the operator's not living up to the standards of the agreement, if there are X number of residents that are complaining or have concerns, then a way that we can adjust and reevaluate if they're not part of that 5-year. Or if they were initially approved for that 5-year permit, then we put them back on a year-to-year, something along those lines.
So we absolutely would incorporate that sort of requirement or assessment into the regulation, and if they were not successful in meeting the conditions of the permit and managing the encampment to meet city standards, then that kind of ability to have that simplified process would be taken away, we'd have to revisit the way that they're managed.
Great, thanks, Mike.
Right, and generally speaking, our land use code does provide for mechanisms to modify or revoke any permit that is issued, including this proposed 5-year permit, if the conditions upon approval are not met or if there are issues with that.
Councilmember Lee and Councilmember Stokes, if you have anything for it. Thank you.
Okay, I like the Councilmember Newhouse suggestion on streamlined submittal requirements, and I appreciate, the staff's consideration, your response that you will consider that. I think that's a good thing, because I do see a streamlined process. It's good as long as it's working properly. And in terms of duration and frequency, I have visited, these encampments, and I've seen what operation is like. And generally speaking, I'm very impressed in how they run the campsites. And I think if it works well, again, if the hosts and the neighbors are happy with it, I see the advantage of having a longer duration. Because you mentioned you've got to look for a place, and difficult. And I've heard stories that if they cannot find a place, they have to go to the woods. They have to go to Seattle to go under the bridges and freeways. Those people. So I can understand that. And alignment of health and safety standards to the consent decree, I think that's a no-brainer. I think that's very good. So ultimately, it's the neighborhood engagement, which I think is very important. And because the flexibility you want to have in terms of even the process, the requirement process, right? The approval process, and also in terms of the duration, frequency. I can understand the reason why it would be good for the encampment, the people, the clients. But it obviously has impact on the neighborhoods. So I would love to see that the neighborhoods are more engaged and better informed. And I think that was suggested by both Councilmember Zion and Newhouse that there needs to be more continuing conversation as we go along. And we heard a couple of neighbors today, talking to us before the council meeting, that they still believe that engagement needs to be better somehow. I don't know how much or how little. It's a relationship, situation. So I think we need to pay attention there. We need to work with the neighbors and to come up with a process that we can actually hear from each other, so that we don't have people coming to us and, well, you haven't listened to us. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stokes.
I think you've done a really good job of putting this together and making it more effective, efficient, and probably serving the people in need a lot better, and at the same time taking some of the burdens off of the operators in the congregations on this. So overall, I think it's very good, and the things that have been pointed out are good. You proposed, and I agree on adopting the proposal that you have put forward on the streamlined permit process. I think that makes a lot of sense. On the neighborhood thing, I know anytime we get into these, there are always some people with concerns, and my impression from everything I've read and been involved in this for some time is that overall the impact and the understanding of it and all is pretty well accepted in the neighborhoods. Some neighborhoods are kind of concerned that it's been in their neighborhood for a long time, but it's not one that we hear a lot of people complaining about their concerns. And I think the important thing in neighborhood communication is if there are concerns raised, then you look at them and take action on those if they are, you can verify, and they're serious actions, which you will do. But my impression is that the neighborhoods and neighbors in general understand this is a very important thing to do, and we are operating under a consent decree, so we have obligations. And it's not something we can just dismiss because somebody's not happy with it, so. But I do think following up with and having periodic input or opportunity for people to, talk to us is fine. And it's never, we've always had people sending us emails if they have a problem, so. But I do appreciate your actually addressing some of the issues that will probably make it a better product in the long run. So I think that's an important piece.
I think you bring up a good point. We've had very successful hostings in other areas of the city. I believe at the first conversation that we had, we talked about First United Methodist Church and how that the church congregation there really listened to the neighborhood, and they made changes in time as the neighbors brought things up. Everyone also remembers that Temple B'nai Torah has hosted 5 times. Now, those hostings started out good, but then the 4th deployment did not go as well. But that changed with the 5th deployment because we had a new rabbi. He was very much put himself and made himself available to the neighborhood. He gave them his contact information. He made sure to have office hours, which is in line with the optional post-issuance meeting. So we changed that by talking with him, and he made those changes. And so it did look different, and we would call it more successful than what took place with the 4th deployment.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and to address that point, as well as Councilmember Zahn's question about why not make the optional neighborhood engagement meeting a requirement, that is certainly something we can look at. The kind of package that has been provided to council as a whole of recommendations is designed to have a neutral impact, if any impact, on the rights of the religious hosts to practice their religious exercise. So modifications to that may require a look at the balance that would result if that were to take place. But there are certainly ways to structure neighborhood engagement that can be effective based on the existing land use code framework we have, as well as the optional methods that Tony and the staff are also available to use.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want me to go? Or do you want to, you said you were going to, you had a couple others, and then
I kind of left off some things. So I support the recommendations that you're making for this. I do agree that the neighborhood engagement should be optional for the neighborhood, not for the host. So if the neighborhood wants that extra engagement, they should be able to have that. And I would just really encourage that whatever organization hosts this, that they work with the city to see what the needs are in the population, because, you know, currently we have a group of women seeking emergency shelter. And it would be great if we could have an organization that could host them for a limited period of time so that they have a safe place to be while they're waiting for their permanent shelter. So I think that charity begins at home, and I think Nancy Lacombe and other staff know exactly what the needs are in our community. Thank you.
Good point.
Okay. So I have some concerns about the whole process and the way this is going. So number one, I would like a circle back to find out if the consent decree will really expire. Okay, and I want people to understand, I know that it runs out, but would it be renewed? So that is one. Mr. Ramos's testimony today led me to believe there's some confusion on, that he had some confusion about this process happening. So number one, if there is that, I have no problem with this continuing into next year. Having said that, I want to, and I go back to what we talked about 13 years ago. I can't think of anything else that is in a single-family neighborhood that is a temporary use that goes for more than 90 days. In fact, I can't think of a single one that does. So that, to me, is an issue, and it gets to the ability to match apples to apples rather than apples to oranges to pears to bananas. And I will tell you that the matrix in here kind of does a little bit of the latter. Sammamish, they've basically had, as I understand it, I may be wrong, but it's really been the Catholic Church there has been the one that has hosted. It's not really right up against single-family neighborhoods. There may be some multifamily around it. It's really in more of a, how would I put it, commercial institutional, because you've got a number of the schools across the street, you've got the church, you have some
City Hall.
civic buildings that are there. Okay, so that's a very different, and I understand that they could probably deploy at a church that may be located in there. Seattle, again, it's very different. I don't think that they are limiting to, I don't think they limit to just churches. I think that probably applies to city-sponsored encampments. I'll ask that as a question.
That particular section of Seattle's code does apply only to religious hostings, and that use is treated as an accessory use as opposed to. So the restrictions applicable to the religious hosts are different from the restrictions applicable to other hosts of temporary encampments that are permitted in Seattle.
But in terms of it, and the headings are off when you get to the second page, but if I understand, Seattle does not have a time frame.
They do not.
Okay, that was sort of that I was getting at just here in terms of the time frame. And then Shoreline is off, and it's got a different time frame. King County, again, there the churches are located in a variety of different uses. Some of them, yes, definitely up near homes. Some of them with some buffer between them. We don't have it. I don't think there's any buffer here. It'll almost always be single family or multifamily or a combination thereof. And so I think that's why this becomes, in my mind, a more sensitive use under Bellevue. I can consider the 90 days or the 120 days. I think there are some arguments for both, but 120 days is a long time. So that's number one. Number two, a few weeks ago, Ms. Morris testified about the public safety and exactly what the deputy mayor asked about. And that is the ID, I'm sorry, I've got to get this back up. That's kind of the ID checks and that sort of thing. So my understanding is we're not codifying that in this new proposal. Is that right?
I think there may be a little bit of confusion regarding the inclusion of resident ID check in Attachment A.
Okay.
So the reason that was included in Attachment A was that the consent decree explicitly modified a requirement in the code. The section of the code that states that reasonable and lawful steps will be taken to obtain verifiable ID, and the resident log will be maintained by the host or the third-party operator approved by the director. The consent decree only modified the second part, which is who will hold the ID log. And that was modified so that the encampment host manager will hold the log. So now there's actually a clear point of contact, a clear responsibility placed on that person or persons to maintain the log.
Okay, so, and I mentioned this morning, I think this chart needs another column, which is what is proposed. Okay, and at this point, I just want to make it really clear, it's a staff proposal. You're getting input from the city. That is an area where I think that I will be asking some questions about what should be in the code and what should be left up to the method of operation. I will say, I think the history that we have doesn't lead me to believe there should be a 5-year permit. I think the history that we just talked about, there have been a couple of sites where the hosting has generally gone well, in the sense that we have not had lots of complaints. However, we have at the temple. It has, and let's just go with the 4th and 5th. One that, as you said, was bad, and I saw Ms. Morris raise her flag, and one that you said was good, which was the 5th one, and I saw Ms. Morris raise her flag about that. So we really need to incent number 5, right? We need to find a way to incent that that's going to happen. But if you do it once, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be done time and time and time again. So I think there has to be a little more within. I'd like to see a little more teeth if it is somehow deemed a success. Then I don't have a problem with providing some quicker aspect of permitting. But if it's successful again, then you get that benefit again. If it's not successful the second time, I don't think we automatically should be granting what would be a 3rd, which is as I think of the timing, that's really what you would be doing, is you would have the opportunity in a 5-year period for the site to host 3 times. Is that right?
The maximum number of hostings for every 5-year permit would actually be 4, but that's the absolute maximum. And that would be subject to there being no interest from other potential hosts, because that permit is still subject to the broader requirements of duration and frequency that apply to all hosts in the city.
Okay, so, but again, then that is an incentive to host in one location all the time. I mean, that to me that is the fallacy of that. If the idea is we don't want one neighborhood to have this all the time, then that is actually an incentive for no one else to step forward. You got it down. I mean, there's something to say about I've got it down, I can do it really well, but I think we ought to make sure they can do it really well each time. And if they do it well the 6th time, great. If they do it poorly the 7th time, then maybe we don't want it to be an automatic number 8, and that's in the case of the temple. Those are just my ways of looking at this. There is a balance that needs to be struck, and there's a balance between regulating and facilitating, and I think good regulation does facilitate a good outcome. And that, I think, is what we are always looking for at the city. Is there anybody who wants to tell me just go pound sand and forget it? But this is really our chance to talk. And as I do feel passionately about this particular issue and the effect that the good effect that it has on being able to house individuals, being able to house our community to exercise its faith. On the other hand, it has to be an experience that works for the neighbors. And I know that, I think, is what we're all trying to get to. Ms. Zahn, you raised your hand.
Yeah, because you raised something that I've been thinking about, which is that we want to ensure success during. So what's been bugging me a little bit is the idea that we have a post-issuance meeting, and then let's say that it's 120 days. I'd like to think that most faith communities actually want to engage with the community, so having some regular check-ins and discussions during would actually make sense. Because what we don't want to do is get to the end, have it be one that didn't work, and then what we're saying is we don't want you to come back when the goal is actually that it's working for the encampment as well as the neighborhood. So it's one that, as you were talking, really struck me, is that if the goal is that wherever it is during that duration of time that it's successful, then what are all the things we should be putting in place, not as a not as a punishment, but as a way to engage with the community for a win-win for everybody. And the way that it's currently written doesn't sound like it really gets to that. And I know there was some discussion about the fact that this is religious freedoms and it should be optional, we shouldn't be forcing anything. But I have a belief that the faith community actually wants to engage and would want the success for the community. So hopefully they wouldn't see this as a hardship, and they would actually see it as actually a positive thing. So I guess I just want to throw that out there as you were talking, Mayor.
Other comment, because we do have some time tonight, and we are kind of getting down to things on this.
I mean, just any response to that?
Well, what I was going to say is that we have had positive temporary encampment hostings throughout the city. We had 2 hostings at St. Luke's Church. We had 2 hostings at First United Methodist Church. Both of those went very well. And we also had a hosting at Church of Resurrection. So we have a history of the church congregation reaching out, listening to its neighbors, and then, providing after-action contact once the temporary encampment permit has been issued. So they are always available to meet with neighbors. The conversation doesn't stop just because the encampment permit has been issued, and they've demonstrated that very well through the previous hostings. I will say, though, that the 4th deployment at Temple B'nai Torah, I believe that encampment did not go very well because of 2 things. You had a change in leadership. Rabbi Morel retired. We had an interim rabbi come in. He had no idea about the requirements of an encampment. And then they had a point of contact, but the point of contact wasn't available when a neighbor would call to complain about operational failures. So there was a host of things that happened with that deployment that were not typical to what happened with the other deployments, or the other 9 deployments that we've had in the city. So I believe it was an anomaly. I don't think that it was a norm, and that's why when the interim rabbi became permanent, he made sure that he was available. He designated himself as a point of contact. He kept office hours, and that was the change. And I would say that BPD and myself thought that was a successful hosting.
So what you just said about that level of engagement, really at the very top from the standpoint of leadership, of commitment to communication, that is one that I think would be good to put in here in terms of maybe expectations. And maybe that's not in a land use code, but there's a companion kind of best practices or something that goes with that. Because I think that's the piece that I'd really like to get a better understanding of, is what does success look like to make sure that we don't end up with any failures. No
So
one wants
I think, and as you heard Ms. Pratt describe, the successful engagements were those where there was ongoing communication. And the idea behind this recommendation was to really take that expectation up to another level, because the code and the requirements for deployments don't have that post-issuance requirement there, or an expectation. So that is the idea, to make sure it is clear that we want to make sure the lines of communication are open. There are people that are reachable, and they're expected to be reachable at any time. When there's a deployment in a neighborhood or at a church. So that is what we were trying to get at with this recommendation. And again, the question, it's a balance about how far over to requirement do we get versus expectation versus the code is silent. So this is leaning into, we want ongoing post-issuance engagement as an expectation in how these deployments
Maybe we should
operate.
call it, good neighbors, right? What are the expectations of good neighbors?
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I think we're I mean, these are good points to bring up. I don't want to complicate it more than it is, though. One, would be interesting to find out the status of the consent decree. I think even without that, this is a valuable thing to be doing. We're putting a shelter in place, but it's not going to house everybody who needs it. This has been operating for some time and seems to have general success, maybe one bad season. And we're going from 90 days to 120 days. That's 3 months to 4 months. It's not like it's there forever, and the difference goes pretty fast. So I'm not concerned about the time as being a big bugaboo in that. And the other is the things that we've been talking about. How far can we go under a consent decree to accomplish these? And if we can't do it putting in the code or something like that, we certainly can do. I think what Mike is saying is the way to approach this. And we probably could have, I mean, it's difficult even with 30 days, I mean, not 90 days, and 120 gives you a little more time, but by the time you find out a problem with the person in charge and work on it, a lot of time's gone. So it's such a short time period. So, what I gather from your conversation is we're a lot more aware and working with them from the beginning on it. And I think that's the key, is to keep tabs with it and work with them, and have ways to, if something is going south in the first couple of weeks, to be able to talk about it. So I think we can work this out. If this is going to happen, we can make it work well. And it sounds to me like there are very few projects that actually over a time period, 5 or 6, 7 years, are absolutely perfect every time. So we understand, we've raised issues and we know what we're looking for in terms of how to make it work better. And it seems to me that we're setting it up in a better way to have it successful. So I appreciate the mayor's comments on this, and he's been involved in this a long time, and he saw what happened at that time. But I think overall we can and we will make this work. And I think you approached it in a very comprehensive way.
Other comments? So I think actually Councilmember Zahn said something that sort of sparked my interest, and that was when you said to be a good neighbor. We did do some work in the permanent shelter ordinance on a good neighbor ongoing group. That may be something to consider of any time there's a deployment, and it may be an incentive to do it. That could be if you establish a good neighbor committee, you can go from 90 to 120 days. I don't know, and I don't want to make this, I think my personal opinion again is we made the Good Neighbor Committee a little too prescriptive in the permanent shelter ordinance. That's always good, but I think in this case some form of that, and I think it reaches that thing of ongoing dialogue. So it's more than an initial meeting, and. So that is an idea that I think we might want to explore. That doesn't have to be a major formal thing, but it might be a 5-member group. And maybe they have gatherings where other people can come to it if you're not a member of the group. Any other comments? So what is the procedure now for moving forward?
So again, we were on these topics. I guess the starting place, as Ms. Lynn described, is the draft as it currently exists is essentially aligned with the consent decree and the way we've been operating for the past 13 years. The 3 other topics, neighborhood engagement, the duration and frequency, and streamlining, were areas that we thought warranted additional consideration for amendments to that draft. If the council would like us to introduce those for the public hearing, we can add them to the draft and open it up for public discussion, understanding that it's not final until the council adopts it after deliberations following the public hearing. If you want to just advance the draft in its current form to the public hearing, that's also an option in front of the council. So on these on neighborhood engagement duration and streamlining the permit, I guess we're just looking for a nod. Do you want us to incorporate language for further discussion and public, comment for the November 8th public hearing?
Okay, thank you. So again, for neighborhood engagement, is there a consensus to do something slightly different or not?
As recommended, you mean, to eliminate the litter control?
No, something more to add. I think if there's, I don't think there's, I'm not sure that everybody, I don't think that there's much of an issue about the litter control. I'm talking about the neighborhood engagement that we've just sort of been talking about. Should there be a good neighbor committee? Should there?
I think there's kind of what's consistent with the consent decree, but I think everybody's giving you something that is workable. It's not a written in, in blood, but or stone.
So I guess this is where, because we're going to put this down and then we're going to ask people to comment on it. If this is the way the council thinks it's going, we should put it in the draft. We still will hear comment on it.
Right.
But so I'm seeing a couple of nods around, but so I'm going to suggest, I didn't really copy down everything here, but a modified good neighbor group, some form of good neighbor that is an ongoing dialogue from before to after.
Which includes that meeting optional meeting we were talking about. Maybe we can put that in there.
I mean, we can try to craft something that it tries to respond to both, which is the optional meeting or ongoing engagement, and then this idea of something that's a little stronger for incentive for improving the efficiency of re-permitting, for example.
Yeah.
Yes, and again, just these optional provisions that will be incorporated into, so I think tonight we're asking for council direction on the whether to include these 3 additional areas, policy topic areas in the draft code that's advanced to the public hearing. The specifics we'll talk about between the city attorney's office and development services to make sure that the city attorney's office confirms that the package advanced at that hearing is like this package here, also has a neutral impact on the religious host's ability to exercise religion.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we are right now.
So, Mr. Mayor, I would move.
Yes, John.
I would move that we add those 3 to the package, and including the expanded neighborhood engagement piece. In other words, some process, as we've been talking. You have to go back and look at the conversation, but I think there's the meat of it's in there.
Okay, so the motion is to add the 3 with an expanded neighborhood engagement. I've not yet heard a second.
I'd like to add another comment before we second that.
Okay, so if there's no second, then the motion just dies for the moment and we'll have more comment. Okay, Deputy Mayor.
So I do like what the mayor suggested, which was a length of stay of 90 days and then some sort of assessment moving toward another 30-day period to maximize the 120-day stay.
Can I argue against myself?
Well, you can,
I would like to
but I
argue
kind of
against it,
liked
too.
it.
Well, I think the practical nature of that is if you give them a 90-day permit, you really can't just extend it again for 30 days while it's going on. But if you were to, an alternative would be if you meet, let's say, the neighborhood engagement level, you would get you could potentially get the 120 days.
I guess my concern is if it's not working, if somehow the facility is not meeting the goals that we've set up, that it doesn't necessarily have to go for 120 days, that we have some period of reassessment after 90 days where we could, I don't know how best to do that, but I would just hate to lengthen the stay to 120 days without some qualification on that.
Well, I think there, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
There are standards and provisions existing in the land use code right now that allow for example, if the city were to receive a complaint regarding a temporary encampment, that somebody was not complying with a provision or a requirement of the code or the permit issued itself, then our code compliance officers would have the authority to go investigate that complaint and to make recommendations as appropriate in response to that. And all of the land use permits are also subject to potential revocation, which by using the voluntary process, revocation has not been applied to a temporary encampment in the city of Bellevue as of yet. Although I just do want to emphasize that that still is an option when things are going poorly in such a manner that there is, it is verifiable evidence that is not operating as it should be and as permitted. But we, again, are open to looking at how we can address those concerns in a way that does not have a net increase on the religious exercise.
Mr. Newhouse, or did you want to follow up on?
Well, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
I do want to follow up on that.
I'm glad there's that clause in there, but I'd like to know, because if they're only there for 90 days, I would think it would be somewhat subjective, and I'm just not quite sure how quickly we would move if there's an encampment only there for 90 days and you got one complaint. So if you can, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but can you be a little specific in terms of would it take 3 complaints before you take action about revoking the permit, or is it 5 complaints, and what type of complaints? So can you give me a sense of what the trigger is for actually moving the encampment or removing their permit to allow them to stay there?
So I think there are probably a lot of factors, as you would guess.
Yeah.
And so when we get a complaint, we, particularly for an encampment, we would respond very quickly to investigate. So, and determine whether it was a valid complaint. And our typical process is to seek voluntary correction. We gain voluntary correction most of the time, very rarely that we don't. If we didn't receive voluntary correction, we quickly escalate that up into a civil violation. So we can, move pretty quickly to, essentially turn up the heat.
Meaning days?
It could be days, depending on the nature of the violation. So if it's a safety concern, it would be immediate. So we, again, there's a whole gradation of level of safety concern. Could it be the sink's not working properly? Okay, that's a health concern, but is it, imminent danger? No. So again, we would deal with those. If we are in a situation where we have repeat violations and a non-responsive host, we would move probably fairly quickly to essentially inform them that we would be revoking the permit if they don't gain compliance. So you continue to step up the level of authority, I guess, to gain compliance up to and including a potential revocation, which we have not had to do to date.
Again, being specific, if we did revoke their license, I'm sure there's a clause in there that allows them a certain number of days to vacate. Do you know how many days they would have to vacate?
Since we haven't faced that, again, it would be dependent upon the nature of the violation. So if there is significant safety, it's like a building that you have a dangerous building condition, and we have required buildings to be evacuated and posted unsafe immediately. It really depends on the situation. It's very hard for me to hypothetically respond to that.
No, I understand. I know there's so many variables, and okay, thank you.
Yes, Mr. Stokes.
Yeah, I still think 120 days is reasonable, and we're talking about a fairly short time period. There is a factor of, I hope that we don't, well, this is why they call government and a lot of things a bureaucracy, because we're bureaucratizing this in a certain extent. We're going to micromanage it a lot. I think we set the parameters, and what you just said is I have confidence that that's your job, is to make sure they meet these and you deal with it. And 120 days makes it a better experience all the way around. I don't argue that one. And I just hope we don't get bogged down in trying to micromanage a situation that doesn't appear to be a big issue. and that we already have ways to deal with it. Happened one time and was not good, but I think we've learned from that, and what you said shows we can do something on it. So I'm comfortable with moving forward on this.
Mr. Lee.
I agree with Councilman Stokes on this, because I think for these people, they really don't have too many options. If they're staying there for how many days and they're given notice, you got to move out, what are you going to do? You're going to move to under the freeways. That's what you're going to get. You know, I think everybody wants some certainty, predictability when they plan on things. They need 6 months, 3 months to plan what's the next thing they can do. So it's very important. So we do have options, obviously, as governments might mention. I mean, if they committed something, we can take actions. So, but I do agree with the mayor, though, on a number of things. But I think that can be resolved basically through engagement, talking to the community, more frequent, continuous discussion. And because the people who are in the campment, they're not going to want to cut their own throat in a way. They want to do the best they can to have a place to stay. And I think they are pre-qualified from that point of view with the operating people, with the host. And I think we have seen that in the past history. We don't have any real people. You know, if they have individuals that may not do that, I think the operator has ways to take care of that, right? I'm sure they do. So they're not going to endanger everybody. So, and the only other thing I want to mention, which we didn't mention, is Mr. Ramos mentioned of their action, you know, Greater Seattle Council of Churches. So it looks like that they are still working on some of the input that we may be able to use for our decision. Yes. So I think I think we need to listen to that. We need to get that input. Whatever that is, I don't know. So I think, but maybe, you know, you have time to do that because you're just making a draft. So I think we still can get input, right?
That's right.
I think Mr. Ramos will promise to work with us as he's done his head. So I think this is something we need to work on. Thanks.
I'm kind of getting a sense at this point that for the purpose of moving forward, we probably ought to leave it with the 120. I'm hearing a couple of people very solid on that. I think you may see after we go through the public hearing process, we may see an amendment that some council members may wish to bring. I'm trying to get us to a point where we've got something where we're down to the 10% level rather than going in with something that might be at the 40% level. So is that okay? Councilmember Zahn, followed by Councilmember Neuenhuis.
I just wanted to add one thing, because earlier I brought up that I do think it would be useful to have at the very end, when the encampment leaves, having kind of a post, just lessons learned to see how it went. And that's currently not in here, so I would strongly recommend that.
So we have done that. So we have conducted an after-action memo. We did that after the 5th hosting at Temple B'nai Torah. So BPD and I went out and we, did an assessment. Why was it so successful? What were the things that were changed? And we identified, we had a point of contact that was available all the time. They kept office hours. And so the report documented those things, and TC4 was also a part of the conversation, and they talked about the things operationally that they did as well. So it was all...
So does it need to be written into the land use code, or it sounds like we already do it, and it's just
We've already...
Okay,
have
that's
been,
fine.
Actually, and that is, first of all, our staff does really remarkable work, and they follow up, and they do all of those things. The question is, do we as a council want to codify that? And that gives, in my mind, and that may give some people
assurances.
What do you call it? A faith in the system, right? Should it, and I don't know who all you went out and talked to, but if there's a good neighbor group that Good Neighbor group should be involved. It should be more than just talking with the temple and talking with the TC4 representatives. So the question kind of becomes, do you want to codify that? Or do you want to just say that that's something that will?
Well, I'd like to codify it,
So,
if fellow council members also agree.
I mean, I would like to see something as part of, and I think this goes to neighborhood engagement, that's where this would go. I think there's at least 3 of us who would like to do something along those lines. And then I think the other would be to stay at this point with the 120-day, with a 12-month gap. I have some questions about that, but, and then what are council members' thoughts on what should we take forward to the public on a streamlined permit process, going everything from there is no streamlined permit process to the permit process streamline that's been that's been suggested by staff, and something in between. And I think especially on the in between, we would kind of need to give some direction as to what that in between is.
On the neighborhood engagement piece, are we keeping the post-issuance meeting? Are we making that optional, or are we making that a requirement? Sorry if I missed that.
The post-issuance? Well, I know they were going to go back and look at it. I kind of heard several council members wanting it to be a requirement.
Yes, correct.
Okay. And it may be that the post-issuance is supplanted by a Good Neighbor type group. I mean, that just as an ongoing dialogue. Again, I don't want to write this on the fly. I'd like you to all have a chance to look at it. So,
I think we can definitely look at both of those options, and just keeping in mind that, council has directed us to move forward with addressing the topic area of neighborhood engagement in the LUCA we bring to the public hearing.
yeah, I think what you're hearing is a little more robust in the codification.
Right.
I think we should leave, I think where we were was leave the 120 and 12 for the purpose, that's not a decision by us that that's what we're going to stay with, but that is for the purpose of going forward with the draft. And now I'd like to come back to the streamlined permit process. I've made my point that I'm not a fan of the 5-year, which could potentially have 4 iterations. I don't know how others are. I don't know. And again, this is for going forward into the draft. Mr. Stokes.
I guess, I mean, I don't know. Again, and it's easy to do this, it's a little more satisfying to really delineate as much as we can and order it and put it in packages and tell you what to do. I don't know. I just don't think that tell me again what the topic was.
Streamlined permitting process.
That's what I'm talking about. Well, I mean, you can streamline, that could be a long conversations, and we have a lot of work to do. And again, you're just trying to, okay, what I was trying to get is, you have to look at the benefits and the process and the effort it takes to get to those benefits and what's really worth it. What are we looking for? Are we looking for a complicated process that details things in great detail and specificity? Or are we saying we want, I think those things you're talking about are pretty self-explanatory. You want to streamline the process, and you know how to do that. That's your job, is to do processes. I don't know, it seems like we're spending more time arguing the details of a temporary, pretty small, directed project. And there are a lot of big projects we go through that we just say, hey, that's good, go out and draft it for us. So I'm just having a hard time with spinning we're going on about getting forward. So I think what you're saying is the concepts you have in there are good, and I trust you to figure out how to make that work. That's my
Deputy
view.
Mayor. So that's I believe, a vote of confidence to move forward with this particular proposal that you've made.
So what you're recommending is that if somebody receives a permit, it's a 5-year permit, and they can, after 120 days, kind of have an expedited re-permitting that has a courtesy letter to the neighborhood, a description of the proposal, gives their arrival and departure dates, and identifies any modification that was made to the previous approval.
For the
So
subsequent years, yes.
So in a 5-year period, how many times could an encampment occur? Could it happen every year after the first 120 days? You'd wait a year and try again? Is that how it works?
So we have this graphic here that
Okay.
we've put together that would visually show what that would look like in a 5-year period.
So it's a 1-year gap?
It's a
1 year gap.
12-month gap between a 120-day deployment. And so as you can see from this graphic, 4 deployments feasibly could take place. Now, the thing that I want to keep in mind here is that although an encampment host could have 4 deployments, what I found is that depending on where these deployments fall, they may or may not even take the whole 120 days.
Yeah.
So, if it's high holidays or something significant, they may not even host, but it at least gives them an idea that based on where it falls, they would be able to host if they so chose.
So I have to ask the question, I know we've had really good success with these encampments in the past, but just kind of as the worst case scenario, if the first 120-day period didn't go so well for the city and for the neighborhood, and there was a reapplication for another opportunity a year later, what are the assurances that we wouldn't repeat what went wrong the first time?
So we would learn from the best practices, and that's what we did between the 4th deployment and the 5th deployment. BPD and we changed the conditions. We looked for different things so that we can provide certainty on how that those deployments would take place. And so that had to do with a point of contact, forbidding the operator from denying residents the ability to call 911, as an example. So we had a myriad of conditions that we added because of the things that we heard and the reconnaissance of BPD that we added to the permit process.
So we might want to put in this something that says that if the neighborhood group that we're working with had recommendations that they want to change on the next one, that we meet their.
Yeah, I think it's part of the, obviously, it's part of the outreach, and the subsequent hosting would really are touching on the things that were important, the communication out to the neighborhood, clarity about what is the duration, when are they coming, when are they leaving, things that are important. I think what might be helpful, just listening to council's discussion on this, in this particular kind of construct, would be providing some additional language on what does success look like in the deployment. What are those key elements of success in the deployment that would ensure that when they do come back, they've met the criteria in the first one, and the simplified process would continue to apply. If not, we can obviously take corrective actions to ensure that when they do return, additional conditions or expectations are established and enforced.
Yeah, I would love to see something like that in this. Thank you.
Councilmember Zahn, followed by Councilmember Lee.
Actually, that was one of my notes was, is it clearly understood what it takes to be successful? But I would add on to that when I look at these 4 items, they tend to be the document, the thing. And it seems to me that the key thing is about the people and the leadership, right, of the actual hosts. And so if the people are changing over time, then we want to make sure that the essence of the folks that understand what it took to be successful are still there, because that's, I think, what we're actually providing in this expedited permit is that clear understanding from the host that these were the things that either made it successful or the nuances that had to be tweaked, so that it isn't one of those where we are providing the letter and the description, and it's this mechanical, technical piece versus the the people part that actually make it successful. So I'd like to see if we can put some nuance in there about that if possible. Does that make sense?
You raise a good point, because if you have a change in administration, then the context gets lost. And so what we've tried to do, as everyone is aware, there has been another staffing change, as an example, at Temple Benai Torah. So we have made efforts to make connections with the new rabbi that has just been installed since July, so that we can provide consistency with what has taken place in the past, so that we can make connections if they choose to host again, that she would have a history and an overview of how those deployments took place in the past and what to look forward to for future deployments.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Lee.
Thank you. I believe that we need to understand. I hope you support that. My assumption. The first year approval doesn't automatically guarantee approval in the future, right? No. So I think if we have a good engagement process with the neighbor and with the hosts and others, operators, I mean, there are a number of parties involved. And if we do it diligently, the city staff, if they don't do it, if they are not satisfactory in the first year, you deny them, right? They should know. They should know during the process, during the first year, what they have to do to maintain good standing so that they can get second-year approval. Then they have the burden on them, the third approval, so on and so on. Anytime during the time they're there, if they're not satisfactory, they're out. So I think the expedited, streamlined process only is assuming that they are performing, they are satisfactory, they're doing what they're supposed to do, right? And if during the engagement process and working with the hosts and other stakeholders, anytime they don't perform, they're out. So I don't think that's a concern. Right. Only this expeditious process only help people who are meeting the requirements.
Right. That
makes
is
sense.
the idea behind the construct
Yes,
that we're proposing.
that doesn't substitute for them working satisfactorily. End of speech.
Councilmember Stokes.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying. I think we all want it to be successful. What I'd like to know is, can we have a session on which we discuss the things that make it successful, and can we line that out? And what kind of manual are we going to adopt that would specify that so that you have something to look at and you check off the boxes for them? I think we're complicating something of people trying to help people, and we're making it difficult to do that, I think. And I'm just a little concerned. We want, I don't know, I'd like you to come back then and tell us what are the criteria? What does the congregation have to do to be successful, and where are the points, and how are you going to monitor that? And what do you do if it's 15 points and they have to meet 10 of them or 5 of them, or what? I think I just want to say, I think we're just complicating a not real complex situation, and we're kind of ignoring the people that need the help, in a sense. And the congregations have a little broader authority to do something than we normally look at. So I'm just concerned about us bureaucratizing this too much. But that's just my view.
Quick response.
Absolutely.
So I think you're right about, there's a question about what level of detail do we put in the code versus we apply discretion when we're administering the code. There's a significant amount of discretion, and we do this every day. And so every situation offers a different set of variables, and obviously council is being clear about, we want to make sure that we're setting this up so we're clear about what success means. So we will work with the feedback and try to figure out, well, what's appropriate language for the code versus from an administration standpoint, what are the things that we put in place to make sure we're clear with the hosts and the neighbors about what it looks like. And we use checklists and all kinds of different tools in the background when we're administering the codes to be clear when there's confusion, or we want to make sure we're being very clear about the importance of various things. And so as Tony's been involved in all of these deployments, she understands all these different nuances, and we've made adjustments. So again, it is that, we don't want to go too far into the details in the code, but we want to be clear enough and have the authority for enforcement to occur effectively, and that's what we'll try to do.
Go ahead, Mr. Newhouse.
No, I think it's been a good discussion because, as I think a lot of council members, and I completely understand Councilmember Stokes, we want to give them the opportunity to be successful. But that's why I think it's a good conversation, because we want this to be a win-win for everyone involved. And we want residents to feel that they do have an avenue, and there is a constant line of communication there if things do go south, and it sounds like that's quite rare. However, I think that's what's really led to the robust conversation, is to make sure that they're going to be heard and we can take action if that scenario presents itself. But I think absolutely, ideally, we all want a win-win. We want the operator to be successful, and we want residents to support this in their neighborhood and have as least disruptions as possible. So again, thank you for the great presentation tonight.
Okay, so the consensus is on this particular topic, the 5-year approval. And again, this is the consensus to move forward to the public hearing and what's in the code. Is the consensus to move forward with the staff proposal, and we take testimony on that. Are there things that anybody would like to see at this point modified in the staff proposal?
Just what Mr. Brennan recommended. Just what Mr. Brennan recommended.
So, and just to restate, to put some additional language that provides kind of more clarity around what does success, we'll have to figure out what that looks like in code language, but we'll try to script something that is clearer about that.
Mr. Lee, and then Mr. Newhouse.
I already said it before, but I just want to mention, we heard Mr. Ramos. He mentioned that, there are further conversation needed to look at principles. He used the word principle, very important, and examine other models and examples. I think that would be good information for you when you make your principle, right? I think that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, I think Mr. Ramos will very quickly send those principles both to the Bellevue City Council and to staff. Thank you. Mr. Newhouse.
Oh, just one comment on the streamlined. I would like to see that to be a meeting, though, still, rather than just a letter being sent. Even if it is streamlined, I still think there's some importance there to having an actual meeting.
Okay. Do you have enough now to work on for the purpose of making some modifications to bring to the November 18 meeting?
I think we have enough to work with. I think we've got a good sense for the council's direction here. And then obviously the council will have opportunity after the public hearing to deliberate additional.
Okay, I'm not looking for another touch by the council, but do you think you need one prior to November 18?
No. I think
great answer. You may need a couple of touches after. I will tell you that. Okay. So I think you've got your direction. That's good. That actually brings us to the end of the public session. Let me get my cheat sheet out here. The council is going to now go into a private session, like an executive session, dealing with a quasi-judicial matter. This is covered under RCW 42.30.140, paren 2. This is going to be approximately 30 minutes, and we will not come back into public session, and so we will adjourn out of executive session. We will not be coming back into any public session to take any public action following that. Okay? Okay. we will go into executive session.